This is What If I Told You, the event psychology video podcast for event professionals in which Victoria Mady, event consultant and host, talks with the world's top minds in behavioral science, neuroscience, and psychology on how to transform events using insights about human behavior and mind. For more science-based tips, join Event Psychology Club at eventpsychology.gumroad.com. Also, check out Victoria's online course, Event Psychology Lab, at eventpsychology.thinkific.com, which covers key behavioral science concepts and offers research-backed solutions to your event challenges. This course is a unique opportunity to upgrade your industry skills and gain a competitive edge without adding to your already busy schedule. Now, enjoy the conversation.
Hello, I'm Victoria Mady, and this is What If I Told You, the event psychology podcast where I talk all things event psychology, that is how to apply brain science insights in events. Today, I'm meeting with Sam Tatam. Sam is the global principal and head of behavioral science at Ogilvy Consulting, an awarded strategist and recognized pioneer of applied behavioral science. Sam's experience stems from a background in organizational, industrial psychology, and advertising strategy, with a passion for understanding consumer behavior at both a macro and micro scale. Today, he leads a global team of talented professionals, psychologists, and behavioral economists to bring this thinking to key Ogilvy and WPP clients, developing interventions and shaping the communications of some of the world's most influential brands and organizations. Welcome, Sam. So glad to see you.
Thanks so much for having me, Victoria. It's my pleasure.
I remember when I first heard you speak, that was at Nudgestock in 2020, I think. And that session got me so inspired because unlike many other topics, no doubt super useful, you talked about exactly what I was eager to learn, applying behavioral science to experiences. And now reading your newly published book, Evolutionary Ideas, which I've got here, very excited about that, I discovered that you discuss solutions to improve experiences across 4 dedicated chapters. I mean, the whole book is packed with insights that event professionals can easily work with, but I love that focus on experiences. So as you can imagine, I'm very excited to have this opportunity to talk to you. And my first question is about that story that you start your book with, about how you were first exposed to the field of psychology. Can you share it?
Of course, and thank you. And I'm pleased we've found an area that we overlap really, really closely with the psychology of experience, and something that there's huge opportunities for us to bring that more closely together. So the story you speak to is actually, in retrospect, I realized this was my first exposure to psychology. I probably realized a couple of decades after. And I would have been about 9 or 10, quite young, at school, and we were given a task, a bit of a homework task, to create a how-to guide. So we needed to come back with a bit of a recipe of how to do something. And some people made up these how-to guides for pancakes or extravagant ant farms. And I remember when you've got such an open brief, it's like, what do I decide to do? And I went home and I remember speaking to my parents. And my dad said something that confused me at the time. He said, "Why don't you teach people how to make a crowd?" And I was sort of a bit dumbfounded with that. And I asked how, and he said, "Well, if you stand looking up, then someone behind you will likely stop to see what you're looking at too, and then there's 2 of you looking up in the tree, and before you know it, there's 3, and that's how you start to make a crowd." And as I said, I think I recall that in retrospect as sort of some of the beginnings of my exposure to psychology. And my dad is an accountant by trade, but he's always sort of intuitively quite in touch with these things. And that's a lovely example of sort of social proof, or just creating a bit of a norm to help interest people in something and begin to make a crowd. So that was sort of some of the earliest, even if I didn't realize that was a lesson in psychology, I think it certainly was.
That is a brilliant story. And I love that you say in the book that understanding human psychology can conjure up value from virtually anywhere, virtually nowhere. What I particularly liked is that idea that innovative ideas are not necessarily new and big. And you mentioned that the field of marketing is particularly obsessed with everything that is big and new, right?
That's right.
And I can truly second that from my event industry experience. And you introduce a different approach to innovation in your book. And it's about evolutionary ideas, ideas rooted in understanding human psychology and evolved patterns around us that are the basis for innovation, right? So why do you think innovation is an evolutionary phenomenon? I know that one needs to read your book to get the answer, but if you could summarize some key points,
of course,
for those who haven't read it yet.
No, of course, and there's a few elements there. The first I think you touch on is this sort of insatiable appetite for the revolutionary, where we naturally gravitate towards novelty and big ideas, and particularly when we're sort of faced with big problems or novel problems, we have a tendency to seek big solutions and novel solutions by which to address it. And I unpack a few reasons for this in the book. The first is an element of sort of ego and status. If we're sort of hired to be innovators, then we feel like we're sort of, if we're adapting from something that exists, we're not doing our job properly, or it might be beneath our level of status to come up with sort of a slight improvement to something that's critical for our organization. So one thing is sort of ego and status. The next is about sort of inbuilt optimism, this natural tendency for us to assume that this time it will be different, where others failed, we'll succeed. And it's really important to have this optimism bias when the cards are stacked against us. Yeah. It's important for us to, it's an evolutionary phenomenon to keep hope and believe that the outcome will be different. And whether that's looking at individuals who failed to go to their health checkups, through to people who still flock to Las Vegas thinking they're going to beat the house. This occurs everywhere, and it also occurs in innovation. And we assume that where others failed, we'll succeed. And the last, for me, the most interesting is around proportionality. I mentioned that we have this tendency to assume that big problems require big solutions, or novel problems require novel solutions. We're sort of proportional often in our outlook. And in the physical world, it sort of makes sense. It makes sense for us to assume that if we hear a loud bang from someone clanging a pot, that it required sort of the same input by which to create that output. If we drop a plate, it smashes. We sort of expect that in the physical realm. But when it comes to psychology and when it comes to ideas, it can be very different. Actually, that small changes can produce big outcomes, and we see this written a lot in the field of innovation and specifically in the field of behavioral science. But for me, I think most interestingly that novel problems don't always require novel outcomes, and oftentimes someone has likely solved it before, and that's really an important bridge, I think, to innovation being an evolutionary phenomenon. And when you think of the word innovation, it's easy for us to conjure up biological evolution, where sort of random genetic mutations give an organism a degree of fitness by which to better survive within an environment. So over time, these sort of mutations help to adapt entirely new species over many different, over sometimes a millennia. And what's specifically interesting is that we can find that under the same environmental constraints, entirely different species can convergently evolve on the same innovation or the same solution. For example, a shark is a fish and a dolphin is a mammal, but surrounded by the constraints of water. They've both convergently evolved on the dorsal fin. So this, in the natural world, happens through sort of mutation over time to succeed within a given environment. And when we look at innovation, then it's easy for us to assume that innovation is net new. And even when we look at some of the world's sort of best known innovations, if we think of the invention of the light bulb, I think Matt Ridley writes that I think 21 people can be claimed to independently have stumbled across the incandescent light bulb. It's just based on the challenge that confronts us that the people converge on the same winning solution. Henry Ford, who is often claimed as sort of the innovative production line of Ford motor cars, he essentially adapted this idea while visiting a slaughterhouse in Chicago. And instead of having a car assembly line, what they had was a cow disassembly line. They hooked cows up on trolleys and took them apart. And Henry Ford thought, let's reverse that and build a car. So what we can do now is adapt on purpose. So it's not random and genetic mutations that help us to survive within an environment. We can spot things in the wild and we can do it on purpose. And that's why I think, and certainly borrow a lot from Matt Ridley's thinking here, that innovation is an evolutionary phenomenon. And when you look at thousands of patents for innovative products, studies have been looking at levels of inventiveness. Actually, a minority is net new moonshot innovation. Up to 95 to 99% of patents have been identified as something that already exists, maybe just not in the category in which you explored it. So I think it's an area that's underutilized, a mindset that's underutilized, particularly in a world that's looking for the big, the bright, the new, the fancy. Sometimes it's already in front of us.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. It's most of the times, right, that it's in front of us, isn't it?
Yeah.
My other question is that in solving many challenges, professionals, and I particularly mean event professionals, because this is where I come from, they often go with their gut feeling. And you point out in the book that we've got a lot of behavioral science wisdom developed over the years, which is reflected in sayings like the safety in numbers, which is essentially about social proof, right? Now, what would you say to those who believe that the gut feeling is all we need?
I think it's a really interesting question, and firstly, for us to not underestimate our gut. Because there's a lot of processes that are occurring beneath conscious awareness that's helping us to determine what's right or wrong. So I think not to underestimate our gut, but there are more levers we can begin to pull on to help to shape effective solutions than just what we feel or what our gut might be telling us. And that's where I think the field of behavioral science has given us a bit of a playbook to help explore potential solutions when faced with challenges. And as you say, it's often over many years, this wisdom's passed down in folklore or religion or kitchen wisdom. A watched pot never boils. I mean, there's a lovely sort of articulation of the psychology that unoccupied time feels longer than occupied time. Given you shall receive is sort of reciprocity in the Bible. So we've sort of known this and we've passed it down, but it's been harder for us to utilize. And that's where the language of behavioral science and psychology is helping us to say, well, actually, that insight, that instinctive feeling is social norming, as you say, or if it's not elicited by a sort of a gut response, we can see how might we consider using scarcity as a driver in this instance. And if that's the case, there are many different examples of solutions that use scarcity that we can learn from and adapt for our brand or for our cause. So I think that the gut is powerful, immensely powerful. And what behavioral science is helping us to do is to codify what many of these intuitive responses are, to help to justify the gut, but also to expand the potential solutions that we might not have considered before.
Absolutely. Well, I cannot agree more. I think it's like helping people sort of translate their gut feeling into intentional actions and intentional steps to improve whatever they want to improve, right? Another huge problem with, for events is the obsession with technology.
Yes.
And a lot of people believe that this is what's going to solve all the issues, like retention or engagement. And I know that you quote Rory Sutherland in your book, and he says that the future will not be technological, but will be psychological. And I love this personally. I love this. So can you talk about that? Why do you quote him, and what do you think about it?
Of course. Well, Rory, if your listeners haven't come across Rory before, he's a huge inspiration of mine, and a big partner in many of the ideas in the book. And what Rory is sort of saying here is that actually the advances to be found in business, in success today, there's much more ground to be made in the realm of the psychological than innovation in technical or engineering or economic terms. I think we've sort of learned more about the human brain in the last 30 years than the last 3,000. And if we look at the margins to be made in advances in technology, they're being dwarfed by the advances that we're learning in psychology. And you mentioned at the very beginning that value can be conjured. And that's the lovely sort of magical element of behavioral science. And Rory's book, Alchemy, helps to capture that a lot, that actually we can create value by how we articulate something or how we frame it. And when it comes to experiences, we'll likely talk about this in a while, that we can start to think about the metrics or the objectives that we're looking to achieve that are different to traditional technological or engineering metrics. We have a whole new realm of objectives that we can hit when we start to explore the psychological. So it's really important. I mean, obviously, I'm sort of the converted here, and it doesn't say that technology doesn't play a role. But maybe the role of technology is then executing the psychological opportunity rather than being the end in itself. So technology is hugely exciting. It allows us to engage with people in slightly different ways. But when we think about it, it in itself is not the solution. Its ability to tap into a human opportunity is what's really exciting. But we need to start there, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, psychology of experiences. Let's get to that. Improving experience without changing duration is one of the 5 psychological contradictions that you present in the book, right? And I recently talked about, and I talked recently about the concept of time at an industry event, and a lot of people got interested into exploring the concept of time more from the psychological perspective. And I know that you talk in your book about clock time versus brain time. And I absolutely love that. And I wanted to ask you, why do you think there is an important distinction to understand for those who are creating experience?
It's a wonderful, wonderful area, and certainly researching the book, it's a space that I learned a lot and really enjoyed. This part of the journey. As you mentioned, so the book explores 5 contradictions that many organizations face. So whether that's aiding decision-making, boosting trust, triggering action, increasing loyalty, and as you say, improving experiences without changing their duration. And to help us sort of understand how we can improve experiences without necessarily changing the duration of an event or a trip itself, we need to better understand this distinction between brain time and clock time. So the difference between the time that's felt and the time that's passed. And what's really interesting when you get deep into the space, at an interspecies level, there isn't a universal experience of time. One study actually looked at the experience of time across 30 different species, from flies and chickens to leatherback turtles, to explore how fast or slow their perception of time is. We always wonder how we see that fly on the wall and we can never catch it. And that is because actually flies view the world faster than we do. And this experiment observed neural patterns of these different animals while exposing them to flickering lights. A bit like if you ever have a recording of a TV and you see the TV flashing, but through our eyes we don't see that, but the camera picks this up. So what the experimenters did was sort of speed up and slow down those flashes to see if an animal could detect it or not. And the faster the flashes that could be detected, the faster that species saw the world, the faster the time went. And it makes sense to have this difference across the animal kingdom. It makes sense that a fly or a hawk processes the world faster than a whale. Right? If a whale was viewing the world as fast as a hawk, I mean, it can't act on it. It'd just swim around the ocean, sort of depressed about all the krill that could have been. You know what I mean? And so it's interesting to see the differences on an interspecies level. But then if we look at just ourselves within that our experience of time isn't consistent. And like an accordion, you can sort of expand it and contract it. Yeah. And there are different emotional drivers or triggers of a faster perception of time or a slower perception of time. And this can be driven by things like novelty, fear, anxiety. All these sort of things can start to slow down our perception of time, funnily enough. So our brain is looking to record every inch of that experience so we can act on it. Experimental paradigms have explored this with things like, it's known as the oddball effect. If you imagine watching a computer screen that's flashing up a series of repeated images, say you've got an image of a cow that's being flashed up, and then amongst the repeated images of a cow, they'll throw in a picture of an apple. And people will say that the apple picture lasted longer than the cows, whereas the actual duration was exactly the same. But because it was a novel stimuli, our brain is like, well, this is new. We need to focus on this. The same thing's true of threatening stimuli. So a spider will feel like it lasts longer than a butterfly, or an object coming towards us will feel like it's going slower than an object going away, because that's a perceived threat. So it's sort of, again, this, when we spoke about our gut, these sort of intuitive statements of time slowing down, when our parachute doesn't open, or time speeding up, or sort of getting to work that day, not even remembering the commute. It sort of makes sense, because the brain doesn't necessarily need to take in every moment of a familiar journey, but the brain certainly needs to be engaged and our attentional resources focused, laying down lots of information when our parachute doesn't open. So once we start to understand this distinction between sort of brain time, the time that's actually felt and experienced, and clock time, the duration that's actually passed, then that provides us with a bit of a canvas by which to explore when we want moments to speed up and when we actually want moments to slow down, and what causes that. So it's a really interesting space.
It is fascinating, I think, and very thought-provoking, and we need to dig deeper into that topic and explore exactly what we can do to change the perception of time when we, create experiences for our attendees.
Completely. Or just appreciating that it's not consistent. The first thing is to know that actually it's not about looking at the hours. It's looking at many things, like sort of the peaks of the experience. It's looking at how we sort of, if it's an hour in a queue, is going to feel different to an hour in a lecture.
Exactly.
And that poses us with different challenges.
So we need to look
different opportunities.
We need to look at like emotions that we want to create and orchestrate, right? And
that's right.
And formats and all those kind of things that will help change the perception of time.
That's right.
Interesting. You also talk about understanding the role of memory.
Yes.
In improving experiences. And I think this is the most critical part that is often overlooked because I think, we discuss a lot within the events community. We discuss attention a lot. And that's fine. I mean, that's really important part, because we need to understand how to grab people's attention and things like that. But I think we don't really pay a lot of attention to memory. And I wanted to ask you, to expand on this and tell the listeners, what do you think the role of memory is?
Yeah, it's really, and again, it's almost the final step. Once we appreciate there's a distinction between clock time and brain time, that the next piece then is the role of memory in that. So Daniel Kahneman, again, many of your listeners will be familiar with Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, has conducted lots of experiments in this space. And one example that he uses to articulate it is sort of imagining if you're listening to a record, you're listening to music, and you've been listening for 2 minutes, and then someone scratches the record and ruins the experience.
Yeah.
And we can appreciate this, and we often, when faced with examples like this, we say, well, that ruined the whole experience. But it's interesting, because it didn't ruin the whole experience. Actually, you had 2 minutes of enjoyment. It actually, what it did was ruin the memory of the experience. And it's the memory of the experience that Kahneman argues is what sort of helps to define future stories and helps to determine whether or not we want to do it again. So we've touched upon this distinction between brain time and clock time. But what's important for us now to look at is this distinction between what Kahneman calls the experiencing self, sort of the moment by moment experience, and the remembering self. So again, it's sort of adding a few layers here, but we need to think about what is the memory of the experience that has a longer duration. And I was recently on a holiday thinking about this, and it's another sort of Kahneman conundrum. Yeah, sort of if you were to think about going on holiday, but you knew that when you got home that your photos would be burnt, would you have a different holiday? And it's a very interesting question to think, well, actually, for many of us, clicking these photos isn't necessarily about capturing the experience at the time. It's about giving ourselves something to look back on. It is the memory of the moment that lives beyond. And we need to consider what are these memories that we're looking to build that have a longer duration and a far bigger role in repeat consumption or positive accolades of an event, or go into the next year's function. It's important that we consider this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this notion of experiences self versus remembering self. I cover this particular thing in the online course that I created for event professionals about how to apply behavioral science insights in events. And I found it when I first read about remembering self and experiencing self, I was fascinated by the concept, because it explains so much about how we store our memories and how memory of any experience influences our decisions, in the future, right? This is just a very interesting concept that changes a lot of thinking around creating experiences, for me at least,
Yeah. And we've got our two elements. We've got to sort of let's almost park clock time and think about the experiencing self and how we can optimize the in-moment experience, but not forget that that's just making a fantastic moment-by-moment experience is not job done.
Yes.
Actually, we need to consider another space here in how we creating these moments of Velcro for our memories, and that tends to be elements of high emotionality and memorability. Again, you don't forget that time that your parachute nearly didn't know, like that. That is a memory.
Yeah.
So it tends to be the moments that slow time down. Funnily enough, when we're looking at the time experience that then also sort of follows through into memory. So what are those moments that we want to slow down and create more Velcro for memory, and what are the parts that we're happy to speed up?
Right. Let's talk about the emotional metrics. I love that, reading that in your book. And so just to mention some of those emotional metrics are attention, arousal, emotion, and time felt, right? And so why are they more important than traditional quantitative metrics?
It's a really interesting area in the concept of emotional metrics. So this is a Roryism, that a lovely frame about emotional metrics, and we tend to be biased towards things that are measurable. So we're probably more biased to look at clock time. Again, we're thinking about that 60 minutes versus that's this moment of attention or arousal or satisfaction. All these components that can be harder to explicitly quantify, and because they're harder to quantify, we tend to sort of downplay them because we can't sort of check the box. And I think Rory's got a lovely example of this from one of his earliest TED Talks that if your listeners haven't watched, you certainly should look at. I think it's sort of Memoirs of an Ad Man, I think, but he spoke about the innovation of the Eurostar to sort of looking to speed up the trip between London and Paris, and how it's sort of natural for us to seek an engineering solution, look at technology to help to speed up the train, and looking at the objective metric of reducing minutes rather than necessarily boosting enjoyment. And Rory's sort of controversial but really poignant suggestion is, rather than sort of spend billions of dollars on tracks and speeding up the trains, is to hire scantily clad supermodels serving free champagne, and you'd have sort of money in the bank to save, and people would ask for the trains to be slowed down. And it's just a wonderful example, and Rory's very special with this, for us to consider, like, we're looking at the wrong metric. You're looking at reducing minutes, but actually if you boost enjoyment, are harder to measure actually this emotional metric, then people don't care about the minutes. In fact, they might even ask to be slowed down because they're enjoying it so much. So I think it's for us to just shift again this fascination and this focus on clock time you're in, and duration spent, to the time that is experienced. The experience of the time that's felt, and the memories that we leave behind. And these are harder to quantify, but they're extremely important for us and for competitive advantage in a world that's focused on clock time. If we can start to prioritize brain time experienced, and the memories that are created, then that's where competitive advantage lies. And that's where we go back to the sort of the future is psychological, not technological. It's not about sort of speeding things up and maximizing the intelligence that people can have in a 60-minute session of an event. It's thinking about, all right, how can technology be an enabler of this? But we need to change what we're looking to achieve, and there's a whole world of opportunity if we seek it.
Absolutely, I love this takeaway. We need to prioritize brain time.
That's right.
Okay, and so my next question, and I couldn't help but ask you that. I was thinking about this question as a must-have for this episode. Did you have to apply any behavioral science insight when you were planning or delivering Nudgestock?
It's a great question. It's one of those things that we probably have done more intuitively than objectively. It's a bit like sort of the cobbler's shoes. You don't prioritize it yourselves. But if we look at what sort of occurs naturally in many functions, and again we sort of see it and start to understand. Oh, that's why we think it's successful. And I think here more so drawing upon an element of our psychology known as the peak end effect. So this is when Kahneman speaks about memories and about the remembering self versus the experiencing self. One of the core insights is around what's known as the peak end effect. That we tend to remember the peak of an experience and how they end. A particular study that sort of helped to unearth this and quantify this, Kahneman found that asking people to place their hands in an ice bath for 60 seconds. So having your hand in 14 degrees of really cold water for 60 seconds. It's an uncomfortable experience. But a second group of people needed to submerge their hand in the same temperature for 60 seconds, but then they were asked to actually keep their hand in the cold water for another 30 seconds, but the temperature was elevated just 1 degree warmer to 15 degrees. And people were asked, which would you like to do again? And most people opted for the second condition. And that's interesting because actually both groups experienced 60 seconds of cold water. If anything, the second group then experienced a longer duration of uncomfortable water, just less uncomfortable than 14 degrees, and they opted for that. So it helps to see sort of how an experience ends can really sort of shape what we do. So when we look at things like Nudgestock in creating peaks first, like these sort of peak moments, if we look at how an event is structured, the agenda is structured. If we think of Nudgestock in 2021, for example, we had Daniel Kahneman and John Cleese as quite a sort of peak mid agenda. And if we look at Nudgestock this year, finishing the event with the team celebrating with a big birthday cake and everyone on stage because it was our 10-year anniversary. So you can sort of start to see naturally that you create sort of peaks in content and really consider how we leave a warm exit that can be that can help to expose a little bit of our culture and really a sort of a positive memory of what's occurred. And then within it, I think if you start to explore sort of peak end effects in other service categories, there's a lot of inspiration here in looking at not just improving the overall experience from a 6 to a 7, but littering it with a couple of unique 10s. And so if we were to look at the hotel industry, for example, there's a lovely example of a great peak that was unearthed by Chip and Dan Heath in their book, The Power of Moments.
The popsicle line.
Exactly, the popsicle hotline in the Magic Castle Hotel in Los Angeles. That it's sort of basically it's a bit of a clapped out hotel, but it's a really magical space. And they look at, instead of looking at the thread count and the linen and they focus on creating these peaks. And one, as you say, is the popsicle hotline, where people swimming by the pool can lift up a telephone and ask for a free popsicle, and a waiter will come down on a silver platter and give you a popsicle. And that's like this amazing moment of like distinctiveness. We see images floating around the internet of people looking at their salt and pepper shakers saying stolen from Virgin Atlantic. I mean, it's just a piece of distinction. Every car has a sports mode. Every sort of premium car has a sports mode, but Tesla has ludicrous mode. It just captures the brain slightly differently. So when we think about that for events like Nudgestock, we need to really innovate in how we're bringing information to life. And if we look at 2021, for example, we had sort of rapid fire questions between Rory and Dan Ariely, just a very different way in which you're sort of bringing people together rather than just sort of keynotes. This year we had Rory and a group of experts talking about the future of electronic vehicles, but the interview was in
one of my favorite sessions.
Wonderful. It's just a different way of so everyone's driving around in Rory's new electric Ford Mustang, and it just brings a slightly different piece of memorability than having a panel of experts sitting on a couch that we've seen before. So I think it's knowing that we're trying to create these peaks, and that can be through speaker and where they live in an agenda, or innovating in how we're delivering this information that feels unique to an event, and you think about the assets that you have to play with to create this distinction. That's where memories are formed.
Right.
We don't always remember the same old keynote, but we do remember everyone driving the back of an electric vehicle, or rapid fire crowded questions between Rory and Dan Ariely. I mean, two sharp minds that tap dance in front of us. I mean, it's great to see. So that's a little bit how it's sort of brought to life within Nudgestock, albeit probably more intuitively than objectively. And I think that's where we ourselves need to consider every year how we're bringing as much to the event in setting the expectations of what people can expect to see on the day, and what we're leaving people with to help to remember it by. What's the Instagram post that is going to remind people of hopefully how much they enjoyed the day.
That's great. You provided a few so interesting examples, and I think a lot of great tips that event professionals can draw on. And I have got a couple of final questions for you. I usually ask my guests 2 questions. First, what would be the single insight that you think event professionals should apply immediately from behavioral science?
I think for me, I think we've talked a lot about this distinction between clock time and brain time, and really mapping someone's sort of journey from knowing about the event, signing up to the event, going to the event, lining up for entry, through to actually what's the piece that we help people to remember it by. I think that's really critical, and in the book we explore everything from sort of expectation management and how sort of expectations really shape experiences, so we can help people to see different things in our event if we prime them accordingly. If you imagine going to try wine, and the sommelier tells you to look for the notes of asparagus. I mean, you drink that Sauv Blanc and you're like, oh, wow, there's so much asparagus in this. So we can help to set people up to experience the event in a way that we want them to. And I think that's really important, because we sort of confirm this rather than like rock up on the day and go, we're totally different. I mean, we can help to guide that. And then in looking, as we've discussed, around these, let's spend less time on hygiene factors, like sort of changing the lanyard paper stock from something that, you mean, that's taking something from a 6 to a 7 on average. Let's find out how we can litter the experience with distinctive 10s, whether that's a popsicle hotline or a stolen from Virgin Atlantic or a panel discussion in the back of a Mustang. What are the ways in which we can create this distinctiveness? And then finally, what are we leaving people with to have as a more of a concrete, tangible reminder? What's that positive end of the record screech that shapes the entirety of our memory of the experience, encourages people to come back, rather than just saying, job's done, we hope you enjoyed your experiencing self, which hopefully, if we do this right, they will. But it's like, well, how are we optimizing for the remembering self?
So these are great tips. Thank you so much. And my last question is, because the podcast title is What If I Told You, I always ask my guests to complete the sentence with one takeaway relevant to our conversation. So what if I told you?
What if I told you, again, going on what we've discussed today around experience, what if I told you that when you're bored, you're actually stressed? And for me, that's an interesting conundrum, that you always imagine when you're bored, you're sort of low arousal, but actually when you're bored, you're really high arousal. Our body's telling us that we need to move on. Like there's no benefit to being bored, stuck somewhere, where there's no social or reproductive benefits to being bored. So our body sort of stresses us out. And we know when we're stressed, as we've discussed before, that time slows down. It's like a double whammy. So we have a slower negative experience when we're bored. So it's just one of those things that boredom is a scary space to be, because we're high arousal, high stress. Time felt when we're bored feels longer than time felt when we're doing a familiar active activity. So it's when we look again, if we to deconstruct what we've just spoken about, these moments of potential boredom in between speakers, lining up for things, waiting for an announcement of something like that. This is all uncertainty again is painful. So how we can reduce boredom and uncertainty, I think, is a key challenge. But I always find it interesting to think when we're bored, you're actually stressed.
I feel like, that's a good start for our second conversation.
Good. I look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was a fantastic conversation. Thank you for joining me today. And everyone, you really don't want to miss all other insights that Sam shares in his book, Evolutionary Ideas. So go and check it out. The links will be in the show notes. Thank you for tuning in to What If I Told You, the Event Psychology podcast. For more brain science insights and for this episode recap, please join the Event Psychology Club. And also, if you want to upgrade your skills and get research-backed solutions for your events, I invite you to take the Event Psychology Lab online course that I created for event profs like you. Thank you, and until next time, bye-bye.